DKG.
DKG. Okay, yes. The few people around here who go by acronyms. You're one of them.
Thank you, DKG.
And I will also take summary notes up here.
Lesson learned: do not speak that close to the microphone.
Okay. Is anybody in the Jabber? Anybody in or going to be in the Jabber room for this session? No, I understand you're not going to do both. You've already volunteered for note taker. Thank you very much. Jabber scribe would be nice, but haven't got a whole lot of people in the room here. Anybody aside from DKG planning to be on Jabber? All right, I guess.
I can try to.
Okay, and you are? I'm sorry, say your last name one more time. Oh, okay, yes. Okay, I know you from Mile. I know how to spell your last name. Thank you. Just didn't know how to pronounce it. Let me just turn this thing off.
All right, we're going to get started in a minute. You all know about the note well.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the Tcpinc session, so make sure you're here for that. Let's wait a minute.
Let me go mess with the media materials manager. The slides are fixed quickly.
Oh, what's wrong?
I'll show you. Show you. It takes 30 seconds. Sorry. This is proof I'm not paying attention. Come on.
No, what's the issue? Because I have a local copy here.
No, but the content is fine. It's just the IETF website.
Oh, okay.
Watch.
These
These are first.
Oh, that's clever. I didn't know they did that.
Those are second. That's third. Right. That's fourth. Done.
It never even would have occurred to me to try to do drag and drop on that, but it says new drag and drop. Yeah. Because otherwise it looks like Web 1.0.
What, you expect group chairs to read the directions? Oh, come on.
No, it's a heuristic, right? If a website looks old enough, I don't try to do certain things.
I guess if you put group chairs to read the directions. Okay. Let's just see. Let's just see. I'm going to reload here.
Shift reload.
It's also possible I need to do something there. Hang on. So, all right. It's possible that I had to hit a button to hit it. Also, I had to hit the save button. Shouldn't have, but we'll see. Select.
Nope. Looks right.
No, looks right. All right.
Yeah, it also might be a cron job that might not reflect immediately.
Okay. It'll happen sooner or later.
Yeah. All right. Want to get started?
Go for it.
All right. Well, welcome to Tcpinc. I'm Kyle Rose. This is David Black. We're the chairs. So since Buenos Aires, we've accomplished a few things. We've adopted the API document, which we talked about last time. There was also the assignment of an XID in place of the option number that TCPcrypt had been squatting on for a while. So all use of option number 69 has been prohibited in both drafts and has been removed from the reference implementation. So going forward, we'll use the XID, and then close to standardization, we'll negotiate for a real option number. So we have new versions of each of the drafts. So TCP Eno is now up to version 3, and TCP Crypt is now at version 2. We've incorporated feedback from several reviews, and we already have reviews of the new drafts already. Yeah, well, your screen. No, see, I can't do that. I can't have two of them open. So, yeah. No, I can see. I can see. You already took it off. So, and also, Miria stepped down as chair because she's now area director. So, congratulations to Miria, and we thank her for her contributions as chair and progressing things here. So, next slide. So these are the milestones that the working group has. Two of them are done so far. The second one was adopting the API draft. The two that we have remaining are actually submitting the unauthenticated key exchange mechanism and extensions to the ISG for publication. This is the TCP Crypt draft, and submitting the extended API to IESG as informational, and that's a draft that still needs some work. So we've adopted it, but we haven't really done anything on it yet. So next slide.
So I think our intent on schedule is that what had originally been one draft of the milestone is now two. It's a combination of TCP Eno and TCP Crypt. And I believe we're going to try to last call these in the working group before Seoul. So the hope is figure out what needs attention coming out of here. I think we may have a few more reviews inbound. We'd like to do a working group last call of these before Seoul, so if we hit anything major, we can respond in Seoul and be done shortly thereafter.
Yeah. So process question: is it worth changing the milestones to add 2 or just?
We probably ought to make the milestones reflect both reality and the fact that there are now a pair of drafts.
Okay, so we'll take that as an action.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what remains to be done for the working group. We want to finalize the TCP Crypt document. So recently the document was restructured to separate the normative protocol description from the design choice discussion, but there have been no major recent protocol changes. So we consider it pretty close to working group last call. We also want to finalize the TCP Eno document. This document was also restructured to improve clarity. There are some remaining issues. I'm not sure that the ones that I put there are actually reflective of reality, but that's what I was thinking when I wrote it at like 1 in the morning. And we would also like to have additional reviews, and I think we're expecting some reviews shortly. We also need to work on the API document. It's been adopted, but we haven't really done much with it. There's still open discussion about whether we want the API document to express things in the form of sort of a socket API, or if we want it to be more abstract than that. And that's something that we'll need to decide as a working group. And finally, there's this related placeholder draft, the Tcpinc best current practice draft, there's nothing in it at the moment. We're basically looking for co-authors with middle box experience because it's something that can complicate protocol changes like this. And so the next slide is very similar to.
Dennis, I think that sorry, this is David Mazieres from Stanford. I think that we decided at the last group that we should rename that document TCP Eno middle box probing instead of best current practices. So just for people to get a better sense of what we're looking for in terms of what that document should be.
Okay. Yeah, we'll make that change. But yeah, so this is very similar to the slide that I had last time. Wherever you see BCP, just replace it with middle box probing. So we would like somebody who has middle box experience to help out with this. Please contact the chairs or the Stanford guys, and we'll get you started. So this is the agenda for the remainder of the session. First up is Dave's presentation on TCP Eno.
Okay. Anybody want to bash the agenda? Going once, going twice, consider it bashed.
Oh, the pink box.
Pink box. If you walk off the microphone, they can't see you anymore.
No, the stand.
That's your mic on the stand.
Oh.
This kind of microphone.
Yeah, you just have, if you want to stay on the video, you have to remain within the pink box, that's all.
Oh, so I have to be, okay. Gotcha.
Did you see a slide? Did you see a slide from Honolulu about what happens when you don't?
No, I missed that.
I will find that. I will find that. That will go up after your talk.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll be talking about the TCP encryption negotiation option document. Next slide. Okay, so this is just some review. Why do we have TCP given that it wasn't part of the original charter? Well, the idea is that we want to abstract away the details of all the different approaches that Tcpinc can take to encrypt traffic, whether it's, say, TCP crypt or TCP use TLS or some future thing. And the real goal is to facilitate adoption of future TCP level encryption protocols. So in particular, given that we've had a lot of headaches over needing a TCP option kind, we want to make sure that new specs, ideally won't need to consume new TCP option kinds once we've been assigned one. We also want to make sure that new specs are incrementally deployable so you can fall back to older specs. And we want to make sure that if people invest the effort into upgrading their applications, that work will still carry over to new encryption specs when those come along. So in addition, we wanted to minimize consumption of TCP option space, since that's obviously a precious resource. We wanted to avoid unnecessary round trip times with setting up connections, and obviously backwards compatibility is key, so we have to revert to normal unencrypted TCP if encryption negotiation doesn't work. Okay, next slide. Can I lower this? I guess not. Okay, so this is just a review of how it works. This is, the active opener sends a SYN segment. It includes an ENO option. That ENO option lists a set of kind of supported specs. Next frame. Then the passive opener replies with a SYN-ACK, also including an ENO option, including its encryption preference, and then next frame. Finally, the third acknowledgement includes an empty ENO option, and then at that point, the connection is encrypted based on the negotiated encryption preference. Next slide. Okay, so we now have two kinds of ENO option, the kind that we hope people will eventually use, which is the top one, and that uses a TCP option kind, which is to be determined. So in a thing that I hope will put this issue to rest, you must not use option kinds that haven't been allocated by IANA. However, we do have an EXID, so we can have a fully IANA compliant prototype implementation that uses this XID 454E, which is ASCII EN. So that's new. And so the good news is, yeah, we're totally IANA compliant. The bad news is now we're spending an extra 2 bytes of option space, and that's really pushing us to the limit. So like for example, we're using all 40 bytes of option space on Apple OS X when we send a SYN segment. We're trying to do TCP crypt session resumption. I mean, maybe we can squeeze out a few NOPs or something, but we're pushing the limits. So it'd be good to get those 2 bytes back when we get a real option kind of sign. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the format of the contents of an TCP ENO option inside a SYN segment. It's basically a series of sub-options where each sub-option is either a general sub-option that has information that applies kind of across the different encryption specs that you might negotiate, and then a bunch of sub-options that are spec identifier sub-options, each one of which kind of offers to support a particular encryption spec. And yeah, and in host A, order doesn't matter. Host B, they're listed in order of increasing preference, although ideally host B only chooses a single spec because it's already heard the SYN segment in the common case. Okay, next frame. Okay, what's the contents of an ENO option in a non-SYN segment? It doesn't matter, it's ignored. So in a segment that doesn't have the SYN flag set, the presence of the ENO option is just there as a flag to indicate that, say, some middle box didn't like strip the option off on the reverse path or something, right? So it's just there as a flag. That means the contents is available to encryption specs if they want to put other data in there. And something that I think was okay in the implementation, but it was not clear in the draft, so we've now clarified. You have to keep sending this non-SYN option until you've received a non-SYN segment from the other side, right? And this is to deal with the case where you do the three-way handshake, and then the active openers, that third packet, that ACK gets lost, and then the active opener sends a bunch of data, right? And if that packet if that first packet with data did not actually contain an ENO option, the passive opener might think that ENO was disabled, and that would be disastrous. So once you've received a non-SYN segment from the other side, you know that that they've received your first ACK packet, so you know that they know that you're using ENO.
Quick question, which may be clear in the draft. You say available for use by encryption specs. Is that available for use once? I.e., has this got to be the same set of bytes every time it's sent until you see until you see the response?
No, it doesn't have to be. We haven't specified that.
Okay, I'd specify it carefully, because otherwise you put an encryption spec at risk of expecting to be able to send some number more of these and actually get sent.
I mean, that's kind of up to the encryption spec, right? It could be that there's a timestamp in there. It could be that, I mean, I don't know what people would use this for, but the point being, it's available if they. At
the very least, specify the rules and specify what encryption spec can expect from this is what's needed in the draft.
Yeah, so
I mean, they can expect whatever they can expect from their own TCP option kind. It's just that I'm not sure I understand what the ambiguity is.
So my reading of the draft was that the ENO option content, the data, was like it didn't matter what it was after in all non-SYN packets, right?
That's right.
And so so applications can use it for basically not applications, but sorry, encryption specs can use it for whatever they want.
Yeah.
I mean, in any further packet.
Right. The question is, if you're writing one of these encryption specs, what can you rely on? Or more importantly, what should you not rely on this doing for you? I mean, example being that you have some reliance on being able to send 5 of these, but after the first 3, we're done. And you don't get to send another 2. So it's just simply a matter of, when you say it's available for use, need to be clear to a person writing the encryption spec who is not going to be a TCP expert. What is the service that you are offering them? And the answer is, I think the answer is that you're going to send it at least once until you get an ACK. It may get sent more than once, but you don't know how many times it's going to be sent until it's ACK and you stop sending it.
Sorry, you can continue to send it. You're not required to send it. You could send an ENO option in every single segment of your whole connection. So maybe this is the part that wasn't clear. The idea is that, like, let's say that, I mean, let me just paint an example, just a particular example, just to kind of like make this more concrete. Suppose that you wanted to like try to preserve TCP sequence numbers, so you wanted to put like maybe a MAC or something inside the header somewhere, right? And you don't want that MAC to be in the data because it can assume sequence numbers and so on. So then you might put the MAC in an option. Now you could just go to IANA and say, like, give me another option kind, but like A, there aren't that many, and B, then there's this chicken and egg problem that's annoying. So we said, hey, turns out we don't actually care what's in the option kind after the SYN segment. So if you want to use that in your encryption spec, there's only one negotiated encryption spec. So like, you're not going to collide with anyone if you use that. And so we tried to address that a little bit in the rationale section. And maybe like offline, we could talk more specifically about what needs to be clarified for that. Okay. Good, thanks. Next slide. Okay, so every sub-option starts with a byte, and this is a format of this initial sub-option byte. Basically, the high bit we're calling V because it stands for variable length data, and then the lower bits are CS. We've simplified this table. So basically, for values of CS between from 0 through 31, those values of CS are shared between a general sub-option, which is always 1 byte, and a length field, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. And then for values of 32 to 255, those are assigned by IANA to encryption specs. And the VBit, if the VBit is 0, then the spec, then that byte constitutes the entirety of the sub-option. It's just a 1-byte sub-option. Otherwise, it's followed by data. So what's new here is we've eliminated we had 16 reserved values before, and that just, it made things more complicated. This is simpler, and we have the reserved values were there for future extensibility, but we have another scheme for future extensibility that you'll see on the next slide. So next slide. So this is what a general sub-option looks like. It used to be 4 bits, now it's 5 bits. The low bit B is the passive roll bit. What's new is it's now required to be set to 1 by all passive openers. So this means the general sub-option is no longer optional for a passive opener. It has to include it, and it has to set the B bit to 1. And this means that we had some complicated scheme where if both sides had the same B bit, then you broke the tie based on who is the passive opener and whatever. And it added a lot of complexity. On top of that, Christoph pointed out that there are some middle boxes, like in particular the ones that are used by Baidu, that if they receive an unknown TCP option will literally like echo that option verbatim back to the active opener. And that would be disastrous, right? Because then the active opener would think it's negotiated encryption spec, it would start sending ciphertext and everything would break. So we were able to, in order to address that problem, we were able to just like, eliminate a whole bunch of complexity by saying, we just have this B bit and the two sides have to set it to different values and the passive opener has to set it to 1. So again, this will just work by default, except in the case of simultaneous open where one side will have to set it to 1 and the other side will leave it at the default value of 0. Okay, so then we have the application aware bit. That's there to point out that the application knows it's using Tcpinc, and so if both sides know that they're using it, then they can do something to increase security, like fold the session ID into whatever authentication mechanism they use. There's a difference here, which is there's now 1 bit instead of 2, and the reason is that we used to have this mandatory mode that said if you want to just completely disable TCP, if both sides aren't aware of it. People pointed out at the last meeting, you don't need to encode that on the wire, you can just do that unilaterally. So now we only have 1 application aware bit, and the other bit we're using as a middleware bit. And the middleware bit is kind of similar to A, it's a way to kind of encode extra information, but it's intended for use by middleware instead of applications. And now we have these 2 reserved bits that should be sent to 0 and ignored on receipt. And what we have for future extensibility is we say only the first general sub-option, you ignore all but the first general sub-option. So what that means is that, let's say we end up using these 2 ZZ bits and it turns out like, we really need a few more bits of general sub-option. We can just say like, okay, if you have 2 general sub-options, then the bits in the second one have completely different meaning, so that preserves some future extensibility. I sense some questions here.
All right. What's your motivating example of middleware?
Can I talk about this on the next slide?
Sure.
Because the next slide.
Yeah, just a very quick clarification question. So why do you need to distinguish between middleware and application? Because all you need to know is the higher layer, right?
Okay, can we go to the
same question?
Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So the first thing I want to point out is that we're not consuming more general sub-options. We already had 2 bits in the last one, and we're still using 2 bits, right? So it's not like we're like slowly like consuming all these precious general sub-option bits. So the intent here is that the A bit negotiates a change in the application protocol that might happen sort of at multiple, later on in the application protocol. An example of this would be you're sending a cookie for authentication, and when the A bit is set on both ends, you hash the session ID and roll with the cookie, right? So that's clearly something you'll want to do to improve security. But that happens that changes the protocol in arbitrary ways. And the idea is that we're never going to like have a draft that tells people exactly how to use this bit. It's really up to the application. The idea of the middleware bit is that it's supposed to trigger an authentication protocol that's prefixed onto whatever else you would have done with your TCP protocol. So here, the idea is that you would maybe like have a shared library that like notices that you've advertised in DNSSEC that like this server is always going to authenticate itself. And so if it would set the mbit and then it would like engage in some protocol before handing the socket back to an application to kind of authenticate that you're really talking to the server. And if it's not, it would either log something or down the road, it would actually like cause the connection to abort because it would indicate some sort of attack. But the idea is you could shim this under an application with just a shared library. And it's kind of orthogonal to the application's decision to use the A bit or not use the A bit.
Chris Anasio, Carnegie Mellon. So what happens when you receive both bits as set, which is do stuff with negotiating in the application and don't do stuff with negotiating in the application?
No. They're like, then you would just do both. Like, let's say your shared library like overrides your DNS calls and your like socket calls, right? You've like got some LD preload thing. And so what it's doing is it's setting the mbit and it's like prefixing before it turns the socket over to the application that's called connect. It actually exchanges a few messages or whatever and makes sure that the server is really the right server. And then the application says, oh, the A bit is set, so I'm gonna like hash the, the session ID when I'm like doing the user authentication part of the connection, say. So the other part of this is that the idea is that there would be some future draft that would kind of specify how to multiplex the mbit, right? So there might be multiple ways of authenticating a server. So what you would need is like a length field and like some UUID or some like identifier to say like what's going on, so that you could skip that message if the server supports something that you don't understand. And so that it's probably not worth doing this until has been standardized. But the point is like, it seems like there would be follow-on work for like integrating with DNS security and things like that that could really benefit from having this extra bit here.
So I know that I found this a little bit confusing as well. So this is one of the things where, this is one of those situations where it might be helpful to have a more concrete example, even if it's just in draft form, but for people to understand what the mbit is in an actual example and where you couldn't do what you wanted to do without it. Does that make sense?
Okay, so let's say, I can give you an example now because it's not that complicated.
Okay.
So let's say that we have not only Dane, but we have this extra thing that you can advertise in a DNS record saying this host is always willing to vouch for its end of a TCP, of an encrypted TCP connection, right? So then when the client sends the mbit, regardless of what application is running on the server, if they negotiate use of the mbit, then whatever the application is going to do, before they do that, they exchange a few extra messages. So an example, like TCP use TLS might use this to kind of trigger like certificate verification, say, of the server. Or you would do verification based on the key that's actually in DNS, say.
Right. Yeah. So going to the Dane example, you're thinking that. So one example might be if the mbit is set, then you require that all the records come from DNSSEC and have proper signing and whatnot.
Or other way around, DNSSEC would say like this host is always willing to use the mbit. So if you don't see this, you might be talking to some weird attacker. And then when you see the mbit and you set the mbit, then instead of immediately launching into the application protocol, the server would like send over a signed message that's like signed.
Okay, some sort of challenge response or
exactly. Or
yeah.
it doesn't even need a challenge because the session ID is the challenge. So it would just like sign the session ID and role, say, and send that down as like the first message from like server to client, say.
Okay. I mean, it sounds to me almost like you have two levels of application awareness here, right? And you, for simplicity, you keep the A completely separate so that applications don't need to know how to interact with the middleware, the as yet unspecified middleware specification.
Yeah, and the point is the middleware specification is not going to solve everybody's problems. Like applications still want the flexibility to just say like I'm going to do my application thing. And the mbit, needs to be governed by some document that lets you know what the server's telling you, and that lets you kind of multiplex the bit among multiple things that are sort of independent of the particular application. They're just ways of establishing the integrity of or the endpoint authentication of like a server that you're talking to. So.
Yeah, cool. I think I still don't understand why you need 2 bits, because from the lower perspective, you have an interface to some higher layer, whatever that is. It might be a middleware or an application, and you just need to communicate to this middleware or to this higher layer, and the higher layer needs to know what the other end wants to do. So you anyway need to have some knowledge exchange before that. So like 1 bit is enough because the higher layer will just know what to do with it, or has to know what to do with it.
But the thing is, you still might want the M-bit there has to be some document that governs how you use the M-bit, right?
Yeah, the 8-bit as well.
And-
Because you need 2 points to do something
See,
together.
no, the idea of the A-bit is that it's really specific to the application, right? And so basically the application can do kind of whatever it wants. And like the IETF doesn't get involved anymore, other than if they're standardizing the application protocol.
Can I interject for a second?
Sure.
Right. It sounds like the A bit is a way of simplifying that negotiation for applications, right? Where those applications don't have to conform to some spec that sort of manages how you multiplex middleware.
Right, and also it can affect the protocol other than just at the beginning. The idea of the M-bit is you prefix something onto what you would have sent otherwise, but you don't otherwise alter the application protocol. The M-bit says before launching into whatever we would have sent over an unencrypted TCP connection, we're just going to do some stuff to kind of help authenticate the connection. The A-bit says we might make tons of changes to the application protocol. It might be just
Well, but conceptually, right? You could have some middleware, some LD preload, right? That looks at the application aware bit and makes does some authentication on that basis, right? That's how you could implement authentication for some protocol that already exists. Right? It's so conceptually they seem like the same thing, but they're separated for convenience.
Yeah,
almost.
because updating your application and updating libc are kind of two different things, right? So you'd want the ability to specify how the M-bit is used, and that applies across every single application. And you might want separately to say well, in the particular case of HTTPS, the A-bit says digest authentication is done differently, for example, and that would require updating your web server as opposed to updating your SSL library, your TLS library.
Can I, so I'm observing a lot of confusion in the room around this, and I want to propose a course of action and see how sad it makes you or other people. What would happen if we didn't specify the M-bit in this draft? Could we get Tcpinc out the door with 3 Z-bits and no M-bits? Because we don't actually clearly have a specific use for the M-bit right now. And then a future draft that wants to use the M-bit could grab one of the 3 Z-bits and use it. And I wonder if that wouldn't clear up some of the confusion and let us actually ship TCP.
I mean, yeah, I guess my point is if this ever sees the light of day, I have the intention to submit a draft that uses another one of these bits. So I gave it a name, but we can just call it Z for now. If that makes people happy.
It's your 0, Z1, and this is going to be Z2, right? And you can submit a new draft.
We'll call them Z1, Z2, Z3. If that makes people happy, or if that's just
I think that would reduce the confusion in the room.
Thank you, Daniel. I had the same thought at the same time. I see Chris holding up two thumbs. So let's do that.
Okay. All right. So I guess we're killing the M-bit. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So there's 2 forms of spec identifier. If the V-bit is a spec identifier sub-options, if the V-bit is 0, it's just 1 byte. It just offers to use the spec that's identified by the 7-bit value, and it doesn't tell you anything else. Some specs have sub-option data, an example being session resumption with TCP and there you set the V-bit to 1, and then the sub-option is followed by 1 or more bytes of data. And obviously the meaning of that and format of that data is dependent on the encryption spec. So next slide. So how do you know how long the data is? Well, by default, the data lasts to the end of the TCP option, right? And that's concise because the TCP option already has a length field, and we anticipate that often you'll only have one sub-option that requires data. However, if you want to have multiple options that sub-options that have sub-option data, you can prefix them by a length field. And there's 2 kinds of length field, only one of which we probably anticipate being used anytime soon. But the form we anticipate to be used is the length byte, which is shown up top there, where you have a 5-bit bit value that says it can specify anywhere from 1 to 32 bytes of sub-option data following the initial byte. And if you need more than that, which would probably only happen if some kind of large SYN option thing happened in TCPM, then we have the length word that goes up to 256, from 1 to 256. And what's new here is that we have a bunch of bits that have to be 0 because, like, you know, maybe we'll both get large SYN options and we'll specify how an individual option can be larger than 255 bytes, but that's so far in the future that we're not even going to try to anticipate what that would look like.
So it's interesting that the maximum value is 32, and if you want to do session resumption, you need 33 bytes.
No, you actually only need like 9 bytes in the current TCP.
Because you truncate.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So I'm trying to think this through must be 0 thing, because the usual, I mean, this is an opportunistic design, right? And so doesn't that mean it's never going to be safe to set this bytes to non-zero?
The idea is that if there's ever a draft in TCPM that, let's say this takes off, right? So if there's ever a draft in TCPM that gain legs that says not only are we going to have a lot of option space in TCP SYN segments, we're also going to allow individual segments to be larger than 255 bytes. Because right now there's just a 1 length byte in the TCP option field, right? Then ideally we could just get involved in that, and like that draft could specify what you should do with TCP-eno if TCP-eno has like taken off at that point. Otherwise, if we ever do get the large options, maybe we would want to specify some way that you could actually have multiple options, so you could spread the data over multiple options. Basically, it's so far in the future that we'll even get more than 40 bytes in the SYN option that I figure why not get TCP-eno out there now, have behavior have bit sequences that are prohibited, and then at the time we're getting a large option, try to specify like how that should be. And we could maybe say, like, if you implement large options and you implement TCP-eno, you must implement this new behavior or something. I just am not going to hold my breath for, I mean, already we can go to 255. So we can already max out the individual TCP options. So it's not going to work for post-quantum crypto, but it'll probably work for ECDHE for a while.
Yeah.
So what if this wonderful new world of lots of TCP options happens, what I thought I heard Ecker's question was, okay, what's your forwards migration / backwards compatibility story?
Okay,
That's correct, yes.
Right. So our forward compatibility story is that we can go up to 255 bytes. 250, yeah, we can go up to 255 bytes. That's our current story. And so if we want to go beyond that, we would have to specify the use of multiple TCP-eno options, and then we would need a way to order them, or we would need one to point to bytes and another one, or maybe once TCP gets large options, there'll also be a way to specify options that are more than 256 bytes. In which case, we could just use the ZZZ bytes as the more significant bytes, so we could get a larger sub-option. But because we have this, where there's 2 limitations that we're fighting against. One is the total option space. The other is that the individual option has this 1 byte length. And so the question is, are those both going to get fixed, or just one going to get fixed? If only one of them gets fixed, which is more likely, namely the total option space, then the behavior specified in the previous draft is totally useless. Being able to specify a 12 byte length for something that is contained within a 256 byte TCP option just doesn't make sense anyway. So we might as well tell people to just ignore this.
Just so I'm not crazy, you meant 12-bit length, right?
12-bit.
I'm sorry?
Just so I'm not crazy, you meant 12-bit length,
Oh,
right?
I'm sorry, I meant 12-bit.
No,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I wasn't nuts. Okay, so I guess, I don't think it's unreasonable to say these values like can't, I guess, I'm just trying to figure out how we write the specification in a way that we haven't just nailed these bits permanently to 0. So so as I understand it, you're saying is that at sometime in the future, there might be a time at which having a larger length would be sensible. And that under those circumstances, you'd be allowed to relax this constraint that this must be 0. Correct?
However, what's more likely is that at some point in the future, we will have a lot of option space, but each option will still be limited to 255 bytes. So we'll need to find a way to spread the contents of TCP/eno over multiple TCP options.
Right.
And in that case, the previous behavior of those Z bits, which used to be M bits, was
Right.
not useful. So if someone has a better suggestion for what to put here, that's fine. Like after thinking about this, I just started thinking like, it's just, whatever I predict, it's just like, probably not going to be the future, so we might as well just.
Okay, so the typical answer here is be conservative in what you send, liberal in what you accept, which is set must be set to 0 on send, must be ignored on receipt, and then if you want them paid attention to, you have to negotiate that you're not speaking Eno, but you're speaking Eno plus, and which puts something in those bits.
Well, no, but then you can't say must be ignored because.
You want them ignored on receipt by this version of the spec. And then when you get, basically, if you're going to want to use those bits in the future, you're going to have to negotiate a spec version.
I think that saying you must ignore them is very problematic because if in the future we have something where it's like, if you support large options, you must do this. I'd rather have it falling back to regular TCP than have people trying to parse fields where they don't know the length of those fields. Like that seems like very problematic.
Yeah.
There are given from I have one question about if I understand correctly, this, the first bits match and so on, and actually this Z bits and M bit is actually N if you in the future.
That's right.
Also.
That's right. It's M and
So it's actually those must be 0 and the M bit actually are parts of the N field in normal case, and if the N is 0 or 1, it has one more byte that actually. So if the N is all zeros, it means that there is 7 more bits of N in the next byte. If N is 1, there is 7 more lower end bits of the N in the next byte, and then we have a high bit set. So you are reserving
Right.
2 specific lengths from the N.
Yeah.
So that's why you can't say actually it must be 0 in this script, because actually you are just reserving 2 values of the N.
Right.
So you can't have a 1 and 2 0 length and 1 byte length.
Right. So you got a 1 byte length and a 2 byte length, and previously I said like, oh hey, well that's 12 bits of length, but it is just hard to imagine any scenario in which those 12 bits of length are useful.
You need to somehow to know which one of these formats is used, and I assume you do have a bit somewhere else in that tells.
Oh no, sorry. It's specified by the next bit, because if the next bit is 0, basically if you look at the two words, basically so the 2 bytes, either the high bit or the second, I'm stuck in this box and I don't have a mouse to point with, a laser pointer. Do you have a laser pointer?
Is this a laser pointer?
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah, it's not doing anything now.
Bit 7, the bit labeled as 7 in the lower diagram tells you whether it's a length word or a length byte.
But I mean, is it the first option where we have this NNN? Isn't after that?
I think these are opposite order.
No, we got
Which one is the
laser
first
pointer.
byte in both of these? Because I mean, is it? If I understand correctly, this first one is.
I think the bits 0 through 7 come on the wire first, right? Yeah, bits 0 through 7 have to come on the wire first, obviously, right?
I mean, I'm assuming network byte order here. So bits, so this byte comes first on the wire, and then this byte comes second on the wire. So you look at this byte, and then you look at the next byte here, and if this next byte here is a variable length, spec identifier. In other words, if the next bit here is 1, then this is a length byte. And on the other hand, you're not allowed to follow a length byte by a 1 byte spec identifier that doesn't have the v-bit set. So if this bit is 0, then that tells you you're looking at a length word.
So again, I don't want to I don't overworking on this. I'm merely trying to observe the property that at some point we can use these bits in the future, right? And so I'm just trying to understand what we're going to write in this spec that then we write in some future spec that says it is now safe to set these bits to 1. And so that's all I'm trying to achieve. So it seems like what you're saying, as I understand it, is that in some future specification, some new set of conditions will obtain, like perhaps we'll be able to have super long options, or perhaps we'll discover we're not going to have super long options, and so we want to rob these bits for some other thing, and then we'll say, when you're sending in this other modality, then it's cool to send Z non-zero. Is that what I should be expecting?
Yeah, only in conjunction with some other new
Other changes.
TCPM draft.
Okay,
Yeah.
good enough.
Okay, I think that's clear. Maybe that can be written down somewhere, or maybe it is in the spec and I just didn't catch it.
I guess I can add that to the rationale section.
I'm sorry, I just spent all morning just dealing with like people, like dealing with cases where like clients will like to send it to servers that non-releasers should be able to interpret it, and actually they can't because the servers are screwed up, and so it'd be really nice not to have that problem. And actually now I feel like David Benjamin, chilling David Benjamin, which is we should say must ignore, and you shouldn't send random values in these Z bits. So the intent is that like one of the things that we tried to achieve in this new draft is that kind of like every possible byte sequence is defined, even if the definition says just completely abort. And so there are places where it seemed like you might want to like you leave the bits, be able to set them later on, and if people just don't know them, they don't do anything. This did not seem to be that case, because it seemed to be like there's this big question in the future of like when we get large option space, will we get individual large options or not? And you might want to go in completely different directions that are so radically different that it didn't seem worth trying to define what these Z-bits do now. It seems like that should be defined in some later TCPM draft. So, which will probably never happen in my lifetime anyway. So we're arguing over like such a remote possibility. What? You're reserving them because you think it might be nice to like have them be like extra length or fragments or identifiers or something like that. But if we really think that that's never going to happen, then we should do something with them. I don't know what.
I mean,
more A and M bits. I don't know.
Okay. The actual answer here is that I don't even think the length word itself is useful. But I'm not willing to like bet my life that like we're never going to see more than 40 bytes of options in like a SYN segment, right? And so just because of that, I figure it's worth trying to define something that could be used in like something that's like a remote possibility, but at least plausible. But it's just not useful to try to go beyond that and to try to like imagine two improbable steps into the future.
All right. So the time being, they must be zero, and they must be zero this time around. That's what we do in the spec.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
Sorry, this is DKG. So just to be clear, they must be zero as long as the TCP option space is as constrained as it currently is today.
Right.
Is that what this time around means? Because that
If the TCP option space ever becomes unconstrained, we'll write a BIS RFC.
No, but to be clear, then that's the point where you don't want your implementations choking. Your implementations need to know whether option space is constrained or unconstrained. And if the option space is currently
I think we're entering the future.
This already accommodates the unconstrained option space where like individual options are constrained to 255 bytes. So this will already scale up to 255 bytes, right?
Mm-hmm.
It won't go beyond that because.
Well, there's no reason for it to go beyond that because right now the individual options are limited to
That's
one
what I
byte,
mean.
right?
That's
The length
what I
is
mean.
limited to one
Right.
byte. So
So-
you'd have to change the format of the TCP header to get it.
No. So I think that whatever draft, like, okay, let's say the TCP, really which takes off, right? People are using this. Then whatever TCP-M does to like extend the option space beyond 256 bytes should modify this RFC, right? It should, the RFC that like goes large should actually say like, it should say like, if you implement large options, you should do this if you're also implementing TCP, right?
Actually, I'm thinking we might just not need the length for it because if we want it at some point, we have to update the TCP.
Yeah, I mean the thing is like in theory, like we could go up to like 40, or 30. So we could go over 32. It's really improbable because then you can't have anything else. But it is possible to have more than 32 bytes. So that's why like it seemed worth doing a length word. And then if you're doing a length word, you might as well go up to 255.
I think we should really concentrate on the stuff we need right now.
Okay. So you think we should actually just get rid of the length word?
Because one thing to consider is also that this adds implementation complexity, and this might encourage people to actually implement it at the end.
I'm happy to get rid of the length word. Is that the sentiment in the room? Does anyone here think it's a bad idea to get rid of the length word? Can you live with 32 bytes of sub-option data? That's not counting the length byte or the V and CS byte. So it's like, it would be length and then the CS and then like 32 bytes after that.
So why don't we take a hum? We'll do a question. So the question is, should we eliminate the length word? Well, let's let DKG talk first.
Just, I think a point of information for people in the room would be to give an example of what the length byte is used for today.
Session resumption.
Okay.
And if we ever got large options, the reason for this, if we ever got large options, we could use it to do a Diffie-Hellman key exchange inside the SYN segment. So that would reduce the number of round trips. And for that, you might actually want to go up to 64 bytes or something. So that's why it's like, it's not that improbable to, I mean, like it could definitely happen that we want to have more than 32 bytes, but you know, again, we could just do that at the time.
Can't we accept that point that just say that if we get a long option space, we can just say that if it's length is 0, that means the rest of the rest of the options, this option is reserved for this option. And I mean, because we assume that most likely we get more options than the 40, but most likely we are not going to be changing the TCP option header, so each option is still limited to 255. So it might be so that we say that if the n is all 0, that means that as long as this TCP option is, meaning rest of the payload.
Oh, no, we already have the rest of the payload, right? So actually, that's actually the case. We already have the ability to do like one option. One of your sub options can be longer than 32 bytes, just not more than one.
So that was
So we actually already have that.
So I think that's actually easy enough for most of the long options.
Okay, so you're okay with
getting to have multiple long options in the same payload, or same the inner options.
Okay, so you're okay with getting rid of the length word?
Yeah, I think so. It
Okay.
seems to be complicated, and I don't understand how it's supposed to be working.
Okay. Simplifies things. Great.
All right, well, yeah, why don't we actually do this officially? So the question is, should we eliminate the length word and just keep it to a length byte? If you agree with that, hum now. All right, and if you think we should keep the length word, hum now. And that seems pretty conclusive.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's easy. Okay, next. Okay, so other changes that we've made. There's a lot of document restructuring. So there's new like terminology and rationale sections. Rationale section tries to like suck a lot of the like column inches out of the normative section. So now like there's like a normative section describing the protocol that's more concise. So if someone wants to implement it, they don't have to like read all the other stuff. We made our first attempt at a plausible IANA considerations section, where we say that IANA has to set up a spec ID registry. We want people to be able to get spec IDs before they've gotten an RFC to avoid like weird chicken and egg problems, but it should be done kind of in anticipation of there being an RFC. So we said that if there's a designated expert who thinks that the RFC is more likely than not, then you can get a spec ID. And with requests published to the Tcpinc mailing list or some successor. And we reserved one of the spec IDs for experimental use. We improved the security considerations section based on some feedback. We were sterner about telling people that opportunistic encryption has weaknesses. And we pared down the experimental section. Really, there's kind of like one experiment that we care about, which is like our middle box is gonna like sync this project or not, or will this actually be worth it? Okay, good. Next slide. So, so to summarize the changes, we now have an XID. The role negotiation now is like simpler, and it has to be explicit. The passive opener has to set the B bit to 1. The general sub option is now 5 bits. We've got future extensibility because subsequent general sub options are supposed to be ignored. There's now one application where bit. There's the M bit, but I guess we'll get rid of that. There is well, I guess we're even getting rid of this the 256 back. So now we're going to 32.
Yeah, we'll confirm both the M bit and the length word on the list.
Okay, cool. And document improvements. Okay, next slide. Last slide. Okay, so what's still to do? So one thing that people still object to is they don't like this term spec. So we have to pick some term and either decide to live with spec or pick some like better term. The problem is like I haven't seen a suggestion for a better term. It's kind of nice if it's just some word that's not used elsewhere. So like we don't want to use like protocol or whatever because that it would just be confusing because it gets used in other places. What?
That's a good question. That would the list discussion said if we work from IPsec, we'd call what's currently a spec, we'd call a protocol. So it'd be it'd be an encryption protocol or Tcpinc encryption protocol.
I don't see the problem with that. This is a protocol. Yes, precisely what it is.
So we have protocols and protocol IDs. But I
Well-
think TCP is a protocol. is a kind of protocol.
TCP is a protocol and server IP. I mean, this just seems like exactly the situation.
Put the right disambiguation word in front of the
Encryption
word protocol. Encryption protocol is a good one to start with. TCP encryption protocol is even better.
Yeah, and maybe a standard abbreviation.
Yeah, well, so that would be nice. If we had a standard abbreviation, that would be nice. But then what? TCP, a TEP, a TCP encryption
Sure, why
protocol.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe that would. If we
TEP,
give it
is that what you're
some
saying?
short word that's like not used elsewhere, and we can just refer to these things, it just makes I think the draft a lot easier to read and write.
You heard the acronym here first.
All right. a TEP. Okay. All right. So so maybe we'll go to TEP, and that'll just solve that. The other issue that it's come up, and it hasn't really. I think we're okay, but like I don't know if it was ever like definitively settled. So this is kind of like a speak now or forever hold your peace kind of thing. It's like, do we want some kind of like TLS key exporter like thing for to be like built into TCP/ino? And the argument why we don't is that the existing requirements make it okay to kind of virtualize the session ID by using the session ID as like a key to generate a virtual session ID and a bunch of other things. So if you wanted to try to like adapt multipath TCP to work with TCP/ino, like you could do it, but you could kind of generate your keys for the multipath or something based on the session ID and virtualize the session ID for all the connections you're gluing together.
Isn't this more of a TCP crypt kind of discussion?
No, the problem is that it's actually unless we want like TCP/ino to work specifically with TCP crypt, but if we want to try to like abstract this away so that like whatever we're doing like will always be guaranteed to work with multipath TCP, then it has to be an ino. And that's part of the problem. It's that like we don't want to get into like, oh, you should use like HMAC as your PRF or whatever, like in TCP/ino. Like that would be a fine thing to say in TCP crypt. So one solution would be just to say like, look, the integration with multipath like should happen at the level of the TEP as opposed to TCP/ino. And another way to do it is just to say that, hey, whoever's like doing this weird stuff layered on top of a TCP/ino TEP would use a session ID as a key to generate a virtual session ID
All right.
and whatever other materials necessary.
Time for another do we need to do it question. Do we need to solve the multipath TCP problem now to get TCP/ino out?
I don't think anyone would think that, but what people might say is that like there should be some kind of key exporter mechanism. Anyway, how about if someone believes we need a key exporter
I'm
mechanism?
going to put Ecker on the spot here. I'd like to hear your opinion on this.
To the best of my knowledge, we do not need this, and if we did, we could add it later.
Okay,
Great.
any objection? Hearing none, that's the sense of the room.
Okay, so this means we'll need to do a small change to TCP crypt actually, because TCP crypt currently like divulges some bytes of session ID. Andrea will talk about that.
Before I have a quick question. How much extra additional effort is it?
It's a little bit annoying, right? It really widens the interface between like TCP/ino and the other
20% of the effort to spec it, 80% of it to check the security.
So right now, TCP kicks upstairs to TCP crypt it sort of delegates to TCP crypt or whatever the other encryption protocol is the responsibility for creating the session ID.
That's right.
Well, can't it do something similar here?
Well, so what we could say is that like instead of generating a session ID, it generates like a sequence of values that you ask for by number, and number 0 is a session ID, and like number 1 could be used by multipath, and number 2 could be, it could basically like expose a PRF instead of exposing a single value. So it's not, okay, maybe it's not that bad, but it is like, it's more complicated to expose a function, to demand that people expose a function than they expose like a single value.
Yeah, well, it's something that would be fine for like a kernel-based implementation of TCP crypt, but would be more difficult if you were delegating to say user space TLS, because then you'd have to get something out of user space every time you needed.
Yeah, I mean, you still have to get the session ID somehow, so you could just request it by number, or you could even implement. You could even have a shim library that implements it. It's doable. I maybe was like overly pessimistic. I mean, okay, so maybe Maria thinks this would be important.
I'm not sure yet, but my second question would be, how would we add this later?
It would be, yeah, I mean, the problem is like, yeah, then we'd have to say like every single TEP needs an exporter function. Or you could say that like you should like, if you, or you could say, but the other thing you could do is you could say like, if you're using multipath or whatever needs to use this, you virtualize the session ID. You have to like rehash this session, use the session ID as a key to generate a virtual session ID and a bunch of keys. So that's how you could add it after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, if it is enough, I guess I would encourage not.
Okay.
Yeah. I can go on about that, but I would encourage not adding it unless someone feels really strongly about it.
Okay, so then we can keep things as is. That means a smaller delta. It means we will, in order to have the ability to add this in the future, we will change TCP crypt to keep the session ID completely secret, even with resumption, which actually is required to comply with the TCP Eno draft as the TCP Eno draft is currently written.
Sounds good to me.
We were just kind of holding off on that to find out about this.
Me again. So the only thing I'm a little bit worried about is like if you use TCP Inc or crypt or whatever and MPTCP and another encryption on top, then you have like, 3 different encryption sessions. Is this what we want, or is this not a problem, or I don't know?
Sorry, 3 different encryption. No. If let's say you're doing multipath TCP, on top of this, right? And or some new version of multipath TCP that's just tailored to this. Then what you would do is you would say the multipath TCP would sit on top of TCP Eno, and it would negotiate it would open a bunch of TCP connections to different IP addresses. Each one would have a real session ID, but it would take the session ID of the first session. It would compute from that a virtual session ID, which is what it would expose to the application. And then it would use the real session ID of connection 0 and also generate some key that it would use to authenticate the other TCP connections so that both sides would know that these TCP connections were all part of the same multipath connection. So this would work. The only issue is that you would be virtualizing the session ID. So if you happen to negotiate an encryption spec that uses, SHA-512 or Ketchik or something to generate the session ID, and then using some other hash function in your multipath TCP, well, now you're maybe depending on like these 2 different hash functions. But in practice, that's probably fine.
Okay. All right, we need to wrap this up in the next.
Okay.
In the next few minutes.
Okay,
so
good. Well,
let me go push on both of those. So first of all, on flame bait. Do you have an actual problem here, or is this just to be something clever you can do while you're in there?
I mean, it would be great to free up some SYN option space, and you have 10 bytes that are being used in the option just to signal use of. Yeah, so yeah, it's something that it's not just that you could do it, but it would work well, because the times when you really want your TCP Eno option to be big are when you're doing session resumption, and that's when you know that the other side probably already supports
Okay,
TCP Eno.
is this something crucial that has to be done to make TCP Eno work in practice?
Look, If no, but it's-
Okay, okay. There's
However.
your flame bait answer. If
No,
you want this
okay.
draft out by the end of the year, you
All right.
need to adopt the version of elegance that
Great.
says you are done with there's nothing left to take out.
Okay, good.
Okay, there's the first one. For the second one, we'll go ahead and ask the question here. For the dedicated TCP option, is your preference to use 69 or to get to get a new one?
I mean, I think it's only fair to use 69 since we've already polluted it.
Okay,
I
good
kinda
enough. Good enough. I want to cut the discussion. We can spend 2 hours on that. We're not going to.
Okay.
Okay. AD always gets an override. Good.
And do you see any deployment problems because you already polluted it?
No, I think everyone will be super happy to have our own option kind, and it'll be well. A flag day seems like a small price to pay to like get your own TCP option kind, so we will totally do that.
Right. You'll need to write a few words about what happens if the new improved TCP runs into one of your older implementations and what's likely to happen. That should be just a few paragraphs that says what's going to happen when these things decide not to talk to each other.
How about we just plagiarize that from TFO, which is that you support both, but you shouldn't use the XID.
Well, no, whatever. You just need to make sure that you have written a sentence or two that says what happens if new code starts talking to old code, and it's I expect it's going to be a long version of nothing interesting happens.
Right. Specifically, if new code using option 69 hits old code also using option 69.
Yes. Then it'll blow up or something.
Right. Well, yeah, yes, and you just write a sentence or two on how it's going to blow up.
Okay.
So, I guess what I'm now wondering is there some way to make it blow up in a clean way that wouldn't be too difficult?
Let's take that offline.
Okay.
Leave it to the gang that knows the code, but that's a really good request.
By doing something illegal, basically, or something, or swapping some bits.
Okay. Well, let's take it offline. But ideally, this is it. And we're if once we do these things plus the other things we're talking about today, we're pretty much in shape for the RFC. And then there's other work that needs to be done in other documents, companion documents. One is TCP, middle box probing. We need a document on that. And then given that we have this experimental, this one TEP ID that's reserved for experiments, we need some kind of document that says how to do that. It's not worth writing that document until we've been actually allocated a TCP option kind by IANA, because it'd be better just to get your own XID at this point. And then I guess how to multiplex bit Z1 or whatever we're going to call it. I actually think that would be good following work to do.
That goes in the draft that you're going to write to define the bit. Okay, we done here?
Yep.
All right, Andrea, I think you're next. And actually, if you want to quick hand me that, let me quickly show you what's. I'm going to go be a little bit of a pest here with I won't make too much of a mess. Somebody asked, why is the purple box important? Here's your answer. Sorry, pink box, purple shirts. You've got closer to 30 minutes.
Yeah, my talk is short, so.
Cool.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm Andrea. I'm going to talk about TCP crypt. So next slide. So this will be a short talk, and promise I haven't added any mechanisms, so hopefully I won't get screamed at for that. So it looks like we're getting really close, and I think really that's my high-level question, maybe to the rest of the people here is, are we sharing that sentiment? So I want you to keep that in the back of your heads. Kind of like, are we done? It would be nice to answer that question soon. Next slide. So what changed in the draft and in the protocol? Really, two things happened. One, we started using the XID, and you heard a lot about that. And two, we've changed the way we signal session resumption. So let me talk about the session resumption thing a little bit. In the previous draft, the way you would signal session resumption was to, include a TEP saying, hey, I want to do session resumption, right? It didn't really say what protocol or what, just resume the session. That created a little bit of an awkwardness because when the app would ask, hey, what cipher suite got negotiated, he would just get back, session resumption. Instead, what we do now is we include the cipher spec we want to resume, and we use the VBit to attach the session ID to it. So now it's, in a way, it's cleaner. So now the app will ask what cipher got negotiated, and he'll get back 256 P256V, which indicates 256 from a resumed session from an initial 256 handshake. So that was a bit of a minor change. It was mostly signaling. As we implemented the XID thing, we noticed that in particular on OS X, on a default configuration, we're using all 40 bytes, including all the other options that macOS sends. Windows and Linux, we still have some headroom there. So that's how we kind of noticed that. We also separated the how and the why in the draft. So now it's very clear what you have to implement. And then towards the end, we kind of give you all the rationale as to why some of the design choices were made. So it makes it easier to read. And a lot of other nits and stuff that we got from you guys. Next slide. So the implementation this time around was kind of had a different vibe. Every time we go ahead and change the code, sometimes we do a 180. We're like, oh, we got to get rid of authenticating the header, or hey, we got to go to TLV. So it's a lot of changes in the core protocol. For this time, I feel like for once we almost had more kind of feature requests and hey, fix this bug rather than change the protocol. So that's nice. We're getting to the point where finally we could focus on getting a solid product out there. Some examples are, hey, update your code so that it works with newer versions of libcrypto of OpenSSL. So we went ahead and did that. Another bug that was found is, for convenience, we had this command called netstat, which would just dump all your connections and all the session IDs. And there was no authentication around this command. And think about how this kind of all started. It was just, if you like, a research project. We just wanted to get something working. So now we're thinking of adding authentication to these calls, to make the code more robust and more production. Even though session IDs, it's okay for them to be public. A kernel implementation would avoid all these problems because when you get a syscall, you know exactly who you're talking to. So this is a bit of an artifact of having a user space implementation where the app and TCP/encrypt are two separate things and they somehow need to talk. And we were just lazy and didn't implement the authentication. And also because it's kind of hard to support that for Windows, Mac, and Linux. That brings complications there. So yeah, many thanks to various people involved in packaging things for various Linux distros and really helping us find all these bugs and work through the code.
So I'm just now a little confused. Maybe I should misunderstood, David. I thought you said earlier that the session IDs had to be secret, and you just said that had to be public. So I'm a little confused with the state of play. I'm not sure if public is bad. I'm just trying to understand.
So the way that TCP draft is currently written, it says that if an application discloses the session ID, there can't be any harm. In other words, it can't contain data that would let you rederive the session keys, right? So it has to be okay to make it public, but that it should also be, it should be indistinguishable from random, if the application doesn't decide to disclose it. So based on some of the discussion in the section, we're gonna have to revise how we do session resumption to avoid disclosing some of those bytes. But now that we know that we're not going to have some kind of exporter, we'll just go ahead and do that.
This is DKG. I just wanted to clarify. I think that you're saying that disclosure of the session ID should not cause any harm to the confidentiality of the session had it been recorded. But that doesn't mean that there is no potential harm to disclosure, right? If it's being used for authentication purposes, that leak could be used to attack the session. So it's not that there's no harm, it's that leakage should not expose any of the confidentiality.
I'm more confused.
So the harm would depend on the particular application, right? So it's certainly fine for some applications to disclose it, like the TCP Crypt website that like, that displays your session ID and like helps you debug your implementation or whatever, like that's fine. But if, for example, we went back to the hypothetical, multipath that uses like the real session ID to create a virtual session ID and also keys and whatever, then obviously like the real session ID, you don't want an attacker to have any idea what's in that real session ID. There might also be like privacy issues. For example, if you're doing batch signing of session IDs on a server for like super fast authentication, where like you don't want to know like which client was. It's just so it's just you don't necessarily want that information just floating around randomly. Like
So I was just going to ask, were you suggesting for the MPTCP case that you would use the session ID as part of the token for like joining?
That's right. So that basically there would be like MPTCP would be layered entirely on top of TCP, and it would use like multiple TCP connections, and those might even be using different cipher specs or whatever, or TEPs as we're now calling them, but that it would create like a single virtual session ID. So to the application, it would look like a single TCP connection.
So perhaps the best way to handle this would be to have a section, and which may be there now these days, but describes what the impact of disclosure of the session ID is. So as I understand it, the situation, let me see if I can recap the situation I understand it, which is if you don't do if you don't do anything with the session ID, then it is safe to disclose it completely. Because it's a one-way out function from TCP crypt, right? And that if you then use the session ID for other things, then there might be impacts if it is then disclosed, right? Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah. So I would suggest maybe a way forward is we don't make any changes to the normative language in the draft, but we add in the rationale section, we add another subsection explaining sort of why we have these requirements and maybe giving some examples.
Well, in fact, what you're describing is classic security considerations material. This is why the session ID is sensitive. You don't want to disclose it. If you do, it has the following consequences.
Well, you might not want to disclose it.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is the reason why I wrote that long message reopening old wounds on the mailing list, because having some TEPs that don't have a problem with the session ID being disclosed and some that do might lead to confusion or implementations doing things that they thought were secure but turn out not to be. I don't, again, I think it's something we could take back to the mailing list. I don't know that we need to resolve it now, but.
So, yeah, from the TEP's point of view, the specification is clear. From the TEP's point of view, it has to be the case that the TEP assumes that the session ID becomes public. From the application's point of view, or from whatever's layered on top of TCP, like it might or might not care depending on what it does with the session ID.
Right. I mean, I understand what you're saying. What I'm saying is if there are two sort of competing uses of the session ID, where one assumes that it's okay to make it public, and the other uses it as as the seed into a PRF that it uses to derive session keys from, I mean, you end up in an unresolvable conflict there. That's one of the reasons why I was asking about an exporter mechanism, but that may be just more complexity than we need, and so it should just be clearly spelled out in the security considerations that this could be a problem, and so implementations need to take care.
Yeah, so it's a part of the security considerations that addresses sort of other TCP-like protocols that are layered on top of Eno, basically. Okay, so we'll add something to security considerations. Let's let Andrea.
Okay. Yeah, cool. So really the point of the slide is we're starting to focus on the code itself and not just like changing the protocol left and right, which is a good spot to be in. Next slide. Yeah, so some of the recent discussions that we've had on the mailing list, I just wanted to spell out some of the points and kind of what we think about them. There was a question as to whether we need some language saying something about RFC 793, given the fact that we ignore unauthenticate if TCP crypt is on and you're talking to an end host and it got negotiated, we will drop FIN packets that are not authenticated, right? So if like an attacker is trying to inject a FIN packet, we will drop it. And so, do we need to update the draft in any way saying, hey, look, there are these semantics changed to 793? I don't know. This is like a question that we need to figure out. There was a question as to whether we should be encrypting frame lengths. There are some ciphers that let you do this. Inherently, you are already leaking a little bit of information based on the packet sizes and whatnot. At this point, we didn't really feel strong about encrypting frame lengths, so we just kind of decided, not to go ahead and implement that because we just don't know what that would look like, and unless there are strong objections, we could revisit that. In Eno, the API document is separate. There was a question as to whether the API document should also be separate for TCP-crypt. It's nice to have a self-contained document, but it's an open question whether we should split the two. I don't know, that point was brought up. And also a point, kind of like a recurring theme has been, how does TCP-crypt interact with the rest of the ecosystem? So for example, TFO, what happens if I turn both on? And I think that could be a good discussion to have after my last slide. But the short version of that is, we could say don't use TFO with Eno, or we could say, it turns out that Eno has a lot of mechanism to implement something like TFO. And just to give you some background as to what the problems might be with TFO and Eno, imagine you're resuming a session to a server and you're like behind a load balancer, and now I'm sending some encrypted GET request or something, and it goes to another server that cannot resume the session. We would have to add language in TCP-crypt to drop that ciphertext, for example, because we would have to start a fresh resumption. So these are kind of the problems you might run into when using all two. I think they're solvable. And the question is, what's the best way forward, right? So should we just say, for now, not use it, or hey, this is the complete solution, or what? That's something we could discuss perhaps at the end. Last slide. So really what's next is kind of like my starting point. Are we, we should be asking ourselves, are we kind of like done? Is it like diminishing returns now of trying to polish every little bit of it? Are we getting there? And if not, what should we do? This is a great time to start a kernel implementation, if things are stable enough. And we still want to maintain the user space implementation because I feel it's very easy to deploy and for prototyping and for other operating systems. So I think our focus is going to shift into, hardening that. And perhaps it would be great if we could get some help on a kernel implementation, or maybe we could start the efforts ourselves if there's nobody out there. But that's really where we stand today. That's it.
Okay. Guess we'll probably go back to his previous slide, and let's go see which one of these we want to spend time trying to have useful discussion on here. I'll start with an easy one. We have enough trouble working on one API doc. I don't understand why we need two.
Excellent. Yeah, I think having a single doc works.
So there are things that you might want to configure with TCP-crypt that are not kind of abstractable to any TEP. So an example of this is, suppose you want to disable session caching, or suppose you want to.
When I get the second TEP, I'll worry about that. Sorry to be a curmudgeon, but.
Okay, so you want, does the document then become like the TCP-crypt API? The goal of TCP Eno is to like abstract away all these things so that if 2 years from now, Ecker wants to slot in TLS, it's just going to work.
Structure the document so it's clear what is TCP Eno, it is clear what is TCP-crypt, and it's clear what the man behind you has to do when he brings TLS along.
Wait a minute. So David, are you arguing that the TCP-crypt API should be inside the TCP Eno API document?
Well, I'm arguing that it's a little bit of an abstraction violation to do that. But
sorry, I was asking this, David, if that's what he meant.
I think a single API document is going to be easier for everybody all the way around. And to the extent that you want to see structure and separation, that's why we have sections in these documents that allow you to clearly separate bodies of material that are related but not the same.
So, I don't have a strong opinion of document separation, so I'll let the chair deal with that. I'm more than happy to review this review this document and call it anything that I think we will be problematic or different, and then help figure out how to address it. But I'm also happy to conform to any document structure the chair would like.
Okay, so I guess we'll try to create a merged document, and there'll be some TCP crypt specific stuff.
Yeah, fine.
Sorry, I'm making it myself.
So, and sorry, to be clear, David, you also object to having this stuff in the TCP crypt document where it currently is. We could leave things as they are and still not have any, we'll still have the same number of documents. The question is, should we take a couple of API calls that are specific to TCP crypt and move them into the TCP API document?
My abstract sense is putting all the API stuff in one place and structuring it so it's clear what's applicable to what
So
is
that's
going
a
to be
yes.
more useful for people who have to implement and use this stuff.
Okay.
Oh, this mic is dull. Subodh, I was wondering, does that imply that to implement, to be compliant with the RFC, you need to implement both TCP crypt as well as TCP eno?
No.
Okay, thanks.
Read the RFC carefully, the requirements be in it. Okay. Let's try to do a little bit on TFO. There was sort of discussion among a bunch of us just before the session started, which I think we left at the very least, explain what happens if you try to do TFO and TCP crypt TCP eno at the same time. What is going on? That seems like the first step.
Okay, so do you mind if I address this, Andre? So basically, there's two possible ways of layering, TCP eno and TFO together, and both result in a suboptimal outcome. So one option will be to say TFO is there in case TCP eno fails, and in that case, what you're going to do is you're going to send a bunch of plain text, and then TCP eno is going to negotiate encryption, and then you're going to send an encrypted version of that plain text, and you've kind of undermined security. So we definitely don't want that. The other way that's equally horrifying is that you send a bunch of like key negotiation stuff or like ciphertext, and then you negotiate some encryption spec, and if it happens that you negotiate a different one from what you used to encrypt the data, then like you'll just interpret all this stuff out of context. So clearly, we think that like TFO as currently specified and TCP eno should not be used together, or maybe must not be used together.
How about, let's see, I thought where we left discussion for the meeting, quick summarize that as a straw proposal we take from the discussion for the meeting was, take what you said and write it down. Explain what goes wrong and how this can be used and abused. And then some of the answers will become obvious. I think must not send plain text that you wanted encrypted sounds like a good use of must. The other one, the other one might be a longer discussion.
Okay. That said, a lot of what TFO needs to worry about, you get for free with TCP eno. So
Okay, so from my point of view, I think we're in violent agreement. The only thing I'm asking for is that old high school teacher line. Show your work. Write down an explanation of what goes wrong when you put these two together, and then we should have no problem coming up with suitable discouraging words.
Okay. And there's a second question. So I can hash this out on the mailing list and then add it to the, we can add it to the eno document. The other question is, should we specify what to do when you receive a SYN segment that contains an eno option and also contains data? And to this, I think that there's actually a very sensible approach that is potentially beneficial. So maybe we should specify that, and maybe we should say people shouldn't send it in case middle boxes, but like they should receive it. Or maybe we should actually say it's okay to do, and there might be like a significant benefit to this. Like you could essentially get the benefits of TFO with session resumption, for free. So it's a question of like, is that worth it, or how do we shim the document to leave it open for some future draft if this is in danger of delaying the current adoption?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth discussing it on the mailing list, like explaining the problem in clear detail, and then discussing a potential solution of including encrypted data in the first flight if you're resuming a session.
Mia, wouldn't you need TFO and session resumption to get the full benefit?
It would be TFO, but it would be specifying that it is okay to include data and ENO at the same time. But it's saying that you'd have to discard the data in the case that like the designated option, if the designated sub option isn't the TEP that you end up negotiating, right? Because suppose I'm going to do session resumption, so I include a bunch of data. Session resumption fails, so now I just want to start from scratch. So that data we just discard, which is not the semantics of TFO. So it would be something specific to TCP-ENO. It would be TCP-ENO having its own TFO-like mechanism inspired by TFO.
Yeah, you might need to use one of those Z bits to indicate.
I thought so, but it turns out we don't actually. The way we would do it wouldn't even require that.
All right.
Okay, but that's a change to the ENO document that you're allowed to send data in the SYN. Yeah, but that makes sense.
Now, one more thing. Let me see if that fin and urge issue is the corner case issue. I think it is. Is there an actual technical problem what to do there, or do we have a spec consistency problem where somebody thinks some 793 language isn't quite compatible with TCP-ENO?
It's a purely mechanical question. Like some RFCs say like updates : RFC whatever. Are we required to say updates : RFC 793?
Not if you can help it.
Great.
Now the question is, did you actually do anything that actually changes 793? I sure hope not. I suspect you and I, Miria, have an offline discussion about this one, or you and I, and between you and I, Andrea and Miria, let's take this one offline, because among the things you do not want to see in your RFC headers update 793. If you would like a lot of unsolicited help, that's a good way to get it.
Yeah, if you thought the option squatting discussion was hard.
We're happy now to put that there, so great.
All right, thank you, Andrea. And so now we're going to have Dave Plonka discuss privacy negotiation with TCP-ENO.
This is, I think, as indicated in the list, a clever idea. Now that we have this option, here's an interesting use to which it could be put.
So this doesn't. This is,
I think Kyle moves your slides for you. Is that what goes on here?
that's fine.
Yeah, I'll just tell me when to advance.
Okay. Well, don't do me by saying it's a clever option. We'll let everyone decide afterwards. Or clever idea. So what this is about, I guess, I spent a lot of my working life about 5 years ago to 15 years ago working on traffic classification. How can you divine by passively watching traffic what it actually is? And a lot of that is focused on classifying encrypted traffic now. You can imagine a lot of people are interested in classifying encrypted traffic, knowing something about it. And SNI is a way where we just give away a lot of privacy information. And I was talking to Stephen Farrell, and he suggested that maybe TCP-Inc. would be a place where we could make this thing that's not negotiable now be negotiable. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk about three things. First, the premise, starting with SNI leaks information that could be considered private information, and certainly we use it for lots of good things like demuxing on the service side, but there's situations where we don't need it. And the privacy challenge about rendezvous-based traffic classification. So rendezvous-based traffic classification is basically, instead of using DPI on most of the traffic, use DPI very selectively on only a few things, adornments, like for instance, the DNS, and then you use it to remember what the addresses were, the 5 tuple that's in the conversation. And so that you can a priori know when you see that traffic later what it's doing. So I'll go through some examples to show you over the last, well, sometimes during the last 10 years, what rendezvous-based traffic classification can do with encrypted traffic and how we probably want to stop this from happening. And then a proposal where I'm really loose about the proposal, but I'm calling it SNOW. If you're not an English speaker, SNOW is a slang word that means deceive. So in this case, if you didn't send SNI, SNOW would be the way, or server name omission would be the way you would deceive people so that they wouldn't know exactly which service you were connecting to. Next slide. So, said this already, SNI leaks private information. The thing that I think would be surprising to most people that use the internet is that when you're in your browser and you see that green lock, that the name that you put there was transmitted in clear text to the server. And most browsers do this, and most TLS applications do this. You guys might know that. People are dumbfounded when you tell the average person that. So for instance, if you're the maintainer of a blog, maybe it's Kyle's got a blog, kylrose.blogspot.com or something, and he uploads a lot of data towards it. You can probably tell that he's the administrator of it because that's the only thing that upload. And now you've given away who you probably are, as one example. So, so when you have SNI there, this is trivial, right? The other way is if you didn't have SNI, you'd have to listen in on another channel, the DNS channel, or however you rendezvoused with the service. Or look at the cert, and so that point is the name comes back the other way. So what I'm suggesting here is there are situations, certainly in opportunistic encryption, where you could make an encrypted session. It might not be authenticated the way a lot of them are now, but you could have encryption and you could avoid passing clear text names back and forth over the channel. Next slide, please. So, so SNI, just for background, was introduced circa 2004. And it was basically to facilitate secure connections to servers that host multiple virtual servers at a single underlying network address. Now, forget that you know all these details, forget we were looking about bits on the wire. Really what this is about is extending the number space or the namespace on the server side, because you just had v4 addresses. So instead of using the 1 tuple, the address, you added the server name on it so that you have a 2 tuple, and that defines that end of the conversation. So really, it's a v4 specific mechanism to allow you to demux on the server side. Let's go to the next slide. So unfortunately, and again, perhaps surprisingly, at least it was to me first, but I understand it why now, SNI is always on for applications that choose to use it. And I think this is really just so you don't incur a round trip time. But initially, why didn't you say, well, we should negotiate. The server can tell me whether it needs the server name to be able to demux on the server side and select the right certificate. But what happens now is the popular clients that use SNI will just send it in the client flow. Next slide. So, so we have an internet today, or certainly if you're using v6, virtual hosting is completely unnecessary. It's just absolutely the case. You do not need to use virtual hosting. You have enough addresses that every web server could have the same. I'm not prescribing this for the whole web. I'm just saying you could envision one would want to make a subset of the web or some new service that had discrete addresses, possibly even discrete addresses for every client that connected on the server side. The other place that it's used heavily is in demuxing on front-end processors or load balancers. But again, this is just a side effect of expanding that number and namespace. It's just to uniquely identify where you want to go on the other end. The v6 address in the case of v6 could be used the same way. Next slide, please.
Sorry, can you just go back to that? So if SNI is leaking private information about which of the endpoints on this host you're talking to, then replacing SNI with a single v6 address leaks just as much privacy information.
Okay, thanks. That's a great point.
So
a point to remind me that I'm going to ask you to think of an internet that's different than the one we have today.
Okay.
For instance, in v6 on the client side, if you see a particular client side address at a point in time with a big 64-bit random number in it, what did that tell you? Nothing, because it could change the next minute, it could change the next hour. So in an internet where you do rendezvous, right now we use rendezvous with typically static v4 addresses on the server side and a static set of names. But if you did rendezvous that was specific to the source, the client source address, I could give a completely different answer to every one of the clients. That's just one vision of a different way you do rendezvous in the internet. But I want to abstract it a little bit to let's forget a little bit about DNS. Let's forget about static addresses that are pinned up on servers. We already have instances of places where we pin up a /64 on a server, and then a whole 64-bit address space is like a pool of dynamic things there that would never need to be used again in your lifetime. Okay, next. So rendezvous-based traffic classification. So what this typically does, and the one that I invented, was about poking into the DNS, doing DPI on the DNS, remembering the associations that which client learned which address, and then you set up a cache so that when you see the traffic passively later, you can, without knowing anything other than the 5-tuple from transport, you know exactly what that traffic was or which service they were going to. And I'll show you some examples of what that allowed you to do. But that was really interesting, especially if you're interested in differentiated services or something. You say, well, if you're going to YouTube and YouTube's slow now, you can jack up YouTube and it already knows what you are. So it was kind of, you were adorning your traffic by using with information that would help you classify it. Well, SNI does that in even a more transparent way. It puts it right in the TCP session. I don't even need to look over in the DNS side. So if I was a good guy, doing this to figure out how to make things, we do it expedited forwarding things, but a bad guy had to look in two places to do this. They had to look in the DNS stream, and they also had passive observation to the web traffic. With SNI, you only need access to the one stream, and you can do a very little tiny bit of DPI and pluck those things out. So SNI is just an extension of the kind of rendezvous mechanism, so let's go. So the last thing I want to say is by putting SNI in, you're giving people like me, or the modern version of people like me, a recipe to test their classifier. What we're doing now is people are doing things like encrypting, putting padding in the packet so that it evades classification. But if you put something right in here that says this is the God's honest ground truth, they can train and train with stochastic models and machine learning until the answer comes out to be the answer that's in SNI. So not only is it a way that gives up the answer during the classification process, it's a way that to authoritatively train systems to do this. Next slide. There's a link here. I have a whole bunch of freely available software out there that does this. I don't mean to bore you because it's going back some, whatever this is, 8 years or something. But these things are just available out there. You can just run them yourself. There are at least 2 patents for techniques about this, one of which I know to be commercially licensed. So there's products out there that use this. And so these are the things that I'm trying to defeat by getting rid of SNI. Next slide. Circa 2008, this is a tree of the traffic, encrypted traffic going to Facebook and things like this, and College Humor, whatever, YouTube, that you could just divine using the mechanism. Next slide. Circa 2009, the mega conspiracy, if you remember it, using this technique, poking the DNS and SNI, you can see everyone that's using these potentially illegal services, like in this case, the one that was shut down, rapid share, mega upload, mega video. Next slide. And then where it is today, just a paper I was just reading in the last couple of weeks, they're saying, using this technique, that because you can find the associations from the names to the addresses like you were talking about, in the web today, 55% of the traffic can just be, once you glean that information, you can just tell by the addresses involved where people are going. And I think they said in this paper for Akamai was even higher than 55%. Next slide. Okay, so SNO means selective server name omission. The idea would be, it doesn't have to be TLS specific, but that's the problem child that I'm trying to deal with here now. So I'm calling it SNO. But the idea is, as Stephen put it, he suggested, how do we turn encryption up to 11 to say, I don't want any clear text going back and forth. So in this case, we're talking, I'm going to use it as an example, changing the client hello selectively. It's if the server wants it and if the client wants it, they can say, I'm not going to exchange this. Next. Okay, so there's the turn privacy up to 11. And it looks like this TCP could do that. I was curious at the end of the conversation, you're talking about mixing the two drafts together. I wonder if you're taking something like TLS and all you're adding to it is the negotiation of something that was previously non-negotiable TLS but allowed. Don't send the SNI and the client hello versus do. Maybe those should still stay separate because really it only relies on TCP, and some kind of hint there. Next slide, or next bullet. And then we know other things going on right now that would work well in concert with this deprive. We're talking about already encrypting the DNS. That's great because that takes away one of the tools and rendezvous based classification, ending a mechanism that would allow us to do the opportunistic encryption without necessarily the authentication that would again work well with this. Next. Okay, so I talked privately with a couple of people involved in this effort. My main fear is delaying TCP no further. Totally understand that. Perhaps finishing this up now with a tiny set of code points, and this being one of the first follow-on things. That was one of the suggestions. And then lastly, and I'm certainly in agreement with this, I think this would be a great time to get this foundation option in there so that some years down the road, we could imagine a way to rendezvous for the web and other services that didn't pass clear text identifiers for the endpoints. And you have a comment or question?
Well, I guess I'm just trying to understand the mechanism you have in mind. So it seems that the mechanism you have in mind is forgetting about which layer it sits at. That the server says, I don't need you to send me SNI, so don't, right?
Yeah.
So it seems to be the problem with that is that the only servers which can, the reason you need SNI is so the server knows which certificate to give you.
Yes.
So the server knows what certificate to give you, right?
If the server has one certificate.
Huh?
And if the server has one certificate,
Then it
send
doesn't,
us
right, then the SNI, but under those circumstances, then you can just connect to the server and elicit the certificate. So I'm not understanding what the privacy properties you get
You're
on.
saying you can do that if you're an active attacker first. So a passive listener, that's not one of the tools available to them. So when all this stuff is going by, like let's say some federal government is able to capture all the traffic at a major exchange point and write it all down.
Yeah.
If this stuff wasn't there, they wouldn't know what that was. They would have to go back to a point in time. They would have to gather rendezvous information. They have to interrogate the server at the point in time the traffic was going on. And I completely agree with you that maybe 99% of the services today, it would be exposed to what you're talking about right there. But if we build this feature in something like TCP now and TCP then in years down the road, we can imagine services where the only person that ever saw that specific certificate was the person that connected at the time with that rendezvous information. As soon as the connection is made, that traffic's passed, it expires the same way that a privacy address in v6 expires, and anyone else could never interrogate it. If you try to connect to it, you're going to get something else.
But I suppose it might be true, but it seems to me that like the precisely the technologies you would need in order to make this work actually require like screwing around with like name discovery. You mentioned deprive, right? If you have deprive, then you could just indicate this in deprive, and you wouldn't have to do the back and forth, right? All right.
I mean, first and foremost, what I'm saying is this is something that could have been negotiable in TLS, but it's not negotiable because we made a performance compromise. We said we're going to send it without being requested to send it.
Okay.
And I'm saying in today's internet, with v6 being 10% or something like that, we certainly don't have that performance limitation, and TCP would allow us to do it in the same number of segments.
Christian Wittema from Microsoft. I'm not speaking for Microsoft. Well, I love the idea. I would love to get rid of the SNI hole. When I look at your proposal, the SNI hole, I mean, this removing SNI is an option that is way down the chain of dependency. The main proposal that you have is basically what you said is to randomize the IP address of the server.
I mean, I disagree. I mean, I know what my proposal is.
Yeah.
My proposal is to take away something that discloses private information, and if we do different things in the future, or to certain potential attackers,
Today, you have one of two solutions. Either you have a solution where the IP address of the server uniquely identifies a service and you don't need the SNI, or you have a solution in which the IP address of the server points to a batch of a vast pool of service, in which case you use the SNI. For your proposal is basically to say, okay, I could dedicate different addresses to each service in the pool, and having dedicated different addresses to each service in the pool, I could then connect directly to the service using the SNI. Is that correct? Without using the SNI, is that correct?
That's one of the ways it could be used.
I mean, that's what
I mean, that's what you can do that today.
Yes. And obviously the problem with that is that it will not take very long for the adversaries that we have to build a catalog of which server has what address.
How many addresses do you think you can store in a catalog?
For
And how many addresses are there in the V6 in the V6 unicast
4
space?
billion addresses in the catalog. But basically, the interesting service are maybe a couple of millions. So that's definitely doable. I mean, they can maintain that. Okay. And so your proposal only makes sense if you do the next step that you're proposing, which is to randomize those servers' addresses.
No, that's one example. I mean, if not you personally, but if one is the sort of person that can only imagine what can be done with this by example, I will give you that example. But what I'm saying is the thing that is regrettable is that we had something that should have been optional and could have been negotiated. We made it non-negotiable. So TCP comes along and gives me the option of using the TCP header to negotiate whether I would have done that in TLS. So I would have, like, if I could go back in time to 2004, I would have preferred it been selectable. I know why we didn't do it then.
Yeah.
But I'm saying there are many visions of how you can make a more private web or private internet without passing these words around that we might not even envision yet. And in the IETF, we don't only do things that can be applied immediately in every possible scenario. We build technologies and privacy into it so that something that someone builds later will have that. We'll be able to use that.
And look, I mean, many of us are trying to block the SNI publication. Dan is doing that. I've been pushing for that. Martin has been pushing for that. I mean, many people are pushing for that in TLS. There are basically the techniques that are the most prominent to do that are form of onion routines. I mean, basically,
I'm sorry.
form of onions.
Form of
Onion routing, Tor.
Onions. And you do a first connection to the farm, and then inside that you do a connection to the service you want. That's the one technique that we have that has a chance of working. But yeah, I mean, what you described about the obfuscation of IPv6 addresses is something that it will be a very cool project.
Okay, but I don't need a working group to do that. What I need the working group to do is to give me the foundation technology that makes sense for me to even build such a thing where browsers will stop sending clear text SNI. You see, I'll do that project. I mean, that sounds like, or I'll have a student do it. That'll be really interesting. But we need the foundation of making this feature negotiable so that the browser is not just giving it away. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'm doing.
The problem with making the feature negotiable is that you have to ensure that the negotiation happens after encryption. Because if you make the negotiation before encryption, then the adversaries are just going to spoof occasional packets and get the answer.
Now you're talking about an adversary that can act as the original client.
Yeah,
You have to be on path. You have to be masquerading as it. And when we're talking about improving privacy and security in the web, we go through all these different levels, right? Opportunistic encryption for passive attackers, opportunistic encryption with active attackers, opportunistic where you're active and you're on path and you are willing to intercept. We have a lot of adversaries out there that aren't willing to do any of those active things, but they can sit there and call all our traffic and know what it was.
The other problem I have is that basically your proposal adds one round trip.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, to TFO it does.
It doesn't add any more than what TCP does.
TFO.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar enough to know.
We sent payload in the first flight.
Okay.
So it adds one round trip, and we are in the classic case of trading privacy for performance. And whenever we do that, and especially for latency, and whenever we do that, I mean, the pressure on the browser to reduce latency is intense, and that becomes very hard.
This is an opt-in thing. The service gets to decide whether or not it says to the client, you don't have to send me this thing. So just like the liberty we have now on a service by service basis, you get to decide whether you incur that penalty for privacy. But I can imagine building web services that are more private than what we have today using this technique, and someone may wish to do that. TFO.
We all want that, definitely, but maybe we should have a private conversation about the discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, so real quick, one of the things that I think I'm going to interpret what Ecker said before, that you could indicate whether to not send SNI using DNS. right? Rather than, no, I'm saying that I think that's what he was suggesting before, that instead of using this mechanism, you could use DNS to say, when you resolve the host name, also don't send SNI, so that you don't incur that extra round trip if you want to use TFO to.
Yeah, and that's a vision, and I'm really, I don't mean this as a negative thing. It's a vision based on the way we do things today. The webs that you're going to use DNS for rendezvous, a web that only uses DNS for rendezvous, and that answer is going to be sitting around to be called by any other adversary. We can imagine a fast flux kind of web that doesn't even allow that. The connections in the 5-tuple are one-offs. I think I heard people propose this. That might be the new version of V4. You reuse dynamic addresses on both sides. Anyway, can you just make sure I don't have another slide? I think the last one just says, what do you guys think? The position should have said proposition, but basically I think that you guys are all clear on that. That's what I'm proposing. And I was wondering who is interested in it and thinks whether or not it could continue here. And as long as you guys have time, I'm willing to get feedback, and I'd rather me stop talking and listen to what you have to say.
Okay, just real quick before we continue with this, does anyone have anything for open mic? Because we've got 5 minutes left. If there's nothing for open mic, then I'm happy to let this continue to the end of the session. Okay, keep going.
Okay, so I don't actually understand what leaving aside the kind of like why we need this fast flux thing or whatever, because strategic IP addresses. As a goal, I think like it would be great if Akamai has some server that's caching assets from like 2,000 different websites, and like someone who's observing my traffic can't tell which of those 2,000 websites I'm requesting assets from. So if I understand, that's kind of your goal here, right?
My goal is not to build any specific thing that uses this. My goal is to have an encrypted.
Sorry, what I just stated was a privacy thing. That like we happen to have.
That's not wrong. That's one possible vision. But when I'm saying I didn't come here to advocate for anything that we don't have yet. I just want to get the client to stop disclosing to the world what it's doing.
Okay, it seems like it might help to kind of think of like that goal is very much like based in mechanism, and it might help to kind of step back and think at a higher level, what is it that you're actually trying to achieve? And if what you're trying to achieve is privacy in this kind of scenario where there's a server that is like caching assets from multiple websites, and an observer can't tell, then you actually can achieve that goal with no modifications to TCP/ino. You just run this on top of TCP/ino, right? And it would you make it double encryption, and that's why the application-aware bit can help. You can do something else. Like actually, Andrea already had a prototype in the very original Tcpinc paper that showed how we could do this basically as a drop-in replacement for TLS. The thing is that you seem to be setting up this, in a way, I think you're being like not ambitious enough, right? Because you're kind of saying like, well, the two options are like either you send SNI or you don't send SNI, right? But like there's another level, which is to say like, actually you can do whatever it is you need to do and not even disclose information based on the IPv6 address. It's just that like you negotiate the encryption and then you do the authentication. And so like, yeah, an active man in the middle might learn whom you're talking to, but the connection's going to break. And so that'll be detected pretty quickly. So why, I mean, especially in the context of TCP/ino, why don't you shoot higher for like, for the better goal of not even having to rely on like the weird.
Yeah, I just don't know of any web servers I can connect to with TCP/ino, but I know a bunch that use TLS. So I thought it was a neat way to say to the browser, the browser is really the limiting factor. People have to change the browser behavior so it stops voluntarily sending SNI. And I think your mechanism is a really neat way to signal that. But
okay, but if you're going to change the browser anyway, you might as well just encrypt the SNI information. And would help you do that. I guess
I think that encrypted SNI has been a rat hole, I think, for a while. But I don't disagree.
So I anticipate Eric's going to talk about that shortly.
So I'm a really big fan of hiding SNI. I could list a whole bunch more reasons beyond what you said of reasons why this is really important. And I was also going to say exactly almost that, which is you can do this right now. If your server supports, in your kernel, you could flip TCP encryption on if your kernel supported it. And then whenever you talk to a web server that supported it, you would be running TLS inside whatever TCP encryption scheme, and your TLS would be encrypted on the layer. And you're, in practice, you can't do this yet. Okay, in practice, you certainly can't do this yet, but I'm not aware of any reason why you, and like, so the browser maybe would set a flag on when it's creating a socket. It would say, I want the fast open option, and that would prevent the kernel from using TCP encryption or something.
Okay.
Fine, but the other thing is we've talked about options for using TLS as the encryption layer in encrypted TCP. My understanding is that those uses would not have an SNIs because they would be talking to basically an ephemeral certificate, or at least that would be the common case. And then if you wanted to do certificate validation, you could send this sort of authentication request after you're already inside the encrypted stream. And so again, that's another way to get what you want without multiple layers already present in the drafts that are in this working group. So I kind of think you've already won.
Okay,
and
so you're
I
saying
think
that the TLS tap would already force, say you can't send SNI?
Right, there would be no
That's
SNI,
what I-
and then you do authentication inside.
That's what I'm interested in, like.
And I think that
was-
basically you should focus on the deprive and Dane stuff. That's where the hard part is.
Okay, that's cool, thanks.
Eric Nygren. Yeah, like we've, well, this is kind of a cute idea that I hadn't really thought about before seeing the slides. I think when we looked at, we spent most of I think it was Denver TLS interim going through the whole space of encrypted SNI and spent I think around a day of it. And we're looking at what are the types of attack scenarios, what are the defenses against them, what are the problems, like bootstrapping, okay, we could put something in the DNS that would help bootstrap stuff. Oh wait, we don't have a good way to put stuff in the DNS without incurring additional round trips. And we looked at, working with DKG on kind of what are the types of cases like wildcard certs or individual certs, and when you might have them split up versus not. And I think one of the things we came to was that a lot of the scenarios where you want to exclude the SNI or ones with doing this traffic analysis is so easy from the IP address. Even if you're rotating it once an hour or so, like the effort required for an attacker to just go and each time it sees an IP go and see what the cert is pretty low. Or if you don't actually have this cryptographically bound into the handshake, then the effort for an attacker to go and just have the routers along the way go and strip this bit out is a pretty trivial piece of functionality that doesn't really even require doing a heavy active attack, but could just be a router feature. So this one by itself may not do it, but there may be other things in this direction that could potentially be interesting. Like I think the handshake signaling of this, of doing it the TCP handshake, and there are some ways I think you could do around stickiness to get it to work with TFO, might allow for some other things in the future. Like it might be a way to say, hey, okay, rather than sending the SNI value, go and hash it in some way with some seed that we've pre-shared someplace, or encrypt it with someplace in a seed we've pre-shared and send that instead. Or I know the cert on the other end is going to be a wildcard cert, so just strip off the first path component, because I think that would actually be one that while still easy for someone to defeat by just stripping the bit off, that at least takes. That was actually one big use case where yes, you can get the wildcard cert, but you have no idea what specific name under the wildcard is there, but oftentimes servers serving up the wildcard cert don't necessarily need the first label anyways.
By the way, mic lines are closed.
Hi, this is TKG. I'm also totally on board with the goals that you have for this. I think it's great. And I wanted to offer yet another way that this could probably be done without delaying ENO, which is just to ask for your own TCP XID. Because it seems like you need one bit, right? And
Yeah. I mean, I tried to take it. I'm not as up on it as Eric was about the background, but all these different modes that were confusing people. I'm like, take it down to just it's there or it isn't. How do you just turn off SNI? And as someone else just rightly pointed out, something has to happen in the browser or libraries on the browser operating system. And if that's supporting TCP ENO and rather than some weird bit just about SNI, maybe that's the way to go, but it would solve the same, would get us the same point.
So anyway, thanks for working on it. I'm happy to talk with you later also about other options for that.
Okay. There's another set of blue sheets out there somewhere? Yes, we need those. Thank you. And I think we're done. Thank you. Thank you all very much. We will, number of decisions made in the meeting, will get confirmed, we'll get confirmed in the mailing list. So Chair, some of us will get, we'll figure out what the email, what decisions that need to get confirmed. We'll get the email out. Okay. And email us the minutes. Tcpinc chairs at IETF.org will do nicely. There's a dash in there, you know that. All right. Leave the binder here. Blue sheets go to the reg desk. Are they filled out?
Yeah, but the others is not just. I mean, last time they said.
Okay, fine. I'm old fashioned. I was always turning them in at the reg desk. If leaving the room works, they just do that. Okay. After having put up that slide on the what the secretariat can do, I just to make sure sheets get turned in. All right.
All right.
Hey, good job. Good meeting. And thank you for all the work. There's no way I would have had time to I mean, I barely had time to skim your slides. So.
Well, yeah. Thanks for like. It's always. I'm not the world's greatest public speaker, so like the first few minutes is always a bit rough for me.
It went from. I'm sorry. That's fine. Yeah. We'll get away from here soon. There ought to be an off switch in these things. Anyhow.
All right.